I stepped out of the car, clutching my daughter's favorite blanket and the little stuffed rabbit she always refused to sleep without. The autumn air in Northern California was crisp, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves, but none of it registered. My focus was on the funeral home ahead, a modest brick building with polished brass handles and the low murmur of gathered mourners spilling from the entrance. Friends, distant relatives, colleagues. I recognized a few faces, all offering the faintest smiles, some whispering behind folded hands. Their glances felt intrusive, as if they could read the shock and grief etched on me. I noticed my mother was nowhere in sight, and that absence struck me before I even crossed the threshold. A folded leaf-shaped napkin on the small casket table caught my eye, a fragile token of thoughtfulness in a room buzzing with tension. Memories of my childhood flashed, my mother's clear favoritism toward my sister, the way attention always drifted away from me no matter how loud I tried to speak. I tried to anchor myself, letting the gentle weight of my daughter's blanket ground me, while noticing subtle cues, a sidelong glance, a half smile that didn't reach the eyes, whispers that stopped abruptly when I looked their way. I pulled my phone from my pocket and hesitated. Should I call her? My mother's absence had opened a wound I thought I had bandaged long ago. When she answered, her voice was sharp, distant. "I can't make it today," she said casually. My throat tightened. "Why not? It's my daughter's funeral." Her laugh was light, almost mocking. "We've got Susan's birthday next week. That's more important." I froze, staring at the crowd that had gathered to offer comfort, realizing she had openly chosen my sister's celebration over grieving with me. Then came the second blow. "Oh, and don't worry about the insurance. I'll make sure the money is ready for her birthday." My chest tightened so abruptly it was hard to breathe. I swallowed, forcing my voice to remain even as disbelief and rage roiled beneath. All those past sacrifices, all the quiet, unacknowledged labor to keep peace, suddenly felt like nothing. The echoes of prior neglect rang in my ears. Old patterns of favoritism that had long gone unchallenged now played out in the most grotesque way imaginable. I ended the call without words, holding the phone too tightly, afraid to look up lest someone see the storm behind my calm. The weight of betrayal pressed down as I watched others respond, or not. Some offered tentative glances of sympathy, yet others seemed almost to side with her absence, as though my mother's priorities were unquestionable. The grief that had been raw and personal now mingled with a sharper edge of anger, a betrayal so intimate it made every polite gesture around me feel hollow. I sat, gripping the blanket, feeling a quiet, simmering determination ignite. I had long internalized the role of peacemaker, the one who endured. But the realization hit me. My patience had enabled this. It was time to reconsider how much longer I could bear it, and how much longer I would allow these patterns to dictate the terms of my life. Memories surfaced, fragments of previous slights, moments where my voice was drowned out or ignored by the very people who were supposed to protect me. Even now, distant relatives whispered about nothing, but their silence about the mother I relied on spoke volumes. I envisioned confrontations I had avoided, imagined conversations where I demanded fairness, recognition, and honesty. Every glance at the absent mother, every murmured comment from the crowd, felt like fuel to the fire of resolve. A moral and emotional framework took shape, quietly forming around a commitment to no longer be the passive figure in the story of my own family. I debated inwardly. Should I call her again, demand answers immediately, or wait until I had the full weight of my resolve behind me? Each option twisted inside me, a cocktail of anxiety, grief, and something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. Then the phone buzzed, jolting me from the spiral. A message appeared that made my stomach sink. My mother had already started the paperwork for the insurance claim, before even showing up, before offering any semblance of sympathy. How could she do this while my daughter wasn't even there? My hands tightened on the toy rabbit, and I felt a surge of determination unlike anything I had experienced in months. Passive patience would no longer suffice. I would need to act, to confront, to reclaim control over a situation that had long been dictated by her selfishness. The crowd around me faded into the background, and all that remained was the fierce, resolute edge of a plan taking shape, sharpened by grief and betrayal. Clutching my daughter's toy tighter, I whispered to myself, I have to confront her before it's too late. I closed the front door behind me, the soft click echoing in the hallway of my quiet home. My hands still clutched my daughter's blanket and toy, but now the warmth they once offered felt like a fragile shield against a flood of memories. The house was too familiar, yet it seemed alien, littered with reminders of my mother's partiality toward my sister. Framed photos of her smiling with my mother hung prominently above the mantel. Birthday cards from decades past stacked neatly on the shelves, and childhood mementos arranged as if curated to highlight someone else's life. The contrast between the home I had worked to nurture, a space of laughter and comfort, and the cold imprint of my mother's influence was almost unbearable. I wandered from room to room, a silent observer in my own space, grappling with grief and a simmering anger I had tried to suppress for years. Each glance at her absence, each echo of favoritism, fanned the embers of resolve quietly forming inside me. By evening, I had settled at my desk, documents and emails spread before me like fragments of a puzzle I could no longer ignore. My daughter's life insurance papers lay at the center, and as I combed through the fine print, I noticed irregularities I hadn't expected. My mother's fingerprints were everywhere. Calls to financial advisors, emails to family attorneys, subtle directives that had steered decisions without my knowledge. Then I found the note, nearly hidden in a thread of correspondence outlining extravagant plans for my sister's upcoming birthday, plans funded with the very money that was meant to support my daughter's future. Fury coiled inside me, raw and undeniable, but beneath it grew a sharp clarity. This was not an accident, not a lapse in judgment. This was a pattern, repeated over decades, now crystallized in financial documents I could hold in my own hands. I thought back to advice from a mentor I trusted long ago. Knowledge is the first line of defense. And now, armed with evidence, I was no longer willing to be passive. I needed perspective, someone who could help me process the betrayal without judgment. I called my friend, someone who had endured similar family deceit, and the conversation brought a strange mixture of relief and renewed determination. I laid bare the details, each discovery heavier than the last, and she listened, grounding me without coddling. Her quiet validation made it impossible to ignore the reality I faced. My mother's machinations had gone unchecked, but I was not powerless. Together we mapped out potential responses, weighing confrontation against caution, considering leverage versus impulse. The discussion helped me see clearly that planning, not reaction, would be my path forward. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a sense of tactical control returning, a focus that allowed grief and anger to coexist without consuming me. Later, I began drafting a timeline, documenting every encounter, every incident that revealed my mother's manipulations. Each entry, from whispered favoritism at family gatherings to subtle legal maneuverings, reinforced a picture I could no longer ignore. Even extended family and trusted advisors seemed swayed by her influence, a network of complicity stretching further than I had realized. A brief conversation with my sister confirmed it in an unexpected way. Her unguarded comments revealed an ingrained sense of entitlement shaped by years of preferential treatment. I made a promise to myself, calm, methodical, and strategic. I would let intelligence and evidence, not raw emotion, guide my next moves. Suspense built in my mind as I considered the first step, weighing every nuance, every predictable reaction, preparing for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Then the phone buzzed. A voicemail from my mother, vague yet charged. Plans are already in motion. My stomach tightened, a mix of dread and anticipation settling into my chest. She believed she could outsmart me, and in some ways, perhaps she thought she already had. But I had seen this play before. My hands tightened around the documents, feeling their weight, not just as paper, but as ammunition, as proof, as control finally within reach. I whispered to myself, it's time we finally face each other. Every ounce of patience had reached its limit. I was ready to confront the web of deceit, armed with clarity, strategy, and a resolve that no favoritism or manipulation could break. The evening outside darkened quietly, but inside, a plan was forming, precise and unyielding, poised for the moment justice could finally be demanded. The drive to my mother's house was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in from every side. The streets glimmered with the late afternoon light, the suburbs pristine and deceptively calm. I couldn't help but notice the familiar cues of her carefully curated world, the polished shrubs, the freshly painted door, the scent of expensive candles wafting from the open windows. Inside, everything would be arranged to highlight my sister's achievements, a shrine to favoritism that had marked my childhood. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as old memories surfaced. Birthdays ignored, achievements minimized, my efforts dismissed in subtle, persistent ways. I replayed the advice my friends and mentors had given me, telling me to stay calm, to observe, to document, to confront with strategy rather than fury. My heart thumped with tension, the fear of what awaited mingling with a deep-seated determination. Every turn down the driveway brought me closer to a conversation I had both dreaded and longed for, a chance to finally unmask the deception that had shadowed my family for years. I stepped onto the polished front porch and my mother appeared, perfectly composed as always, a smile that barely touched her eyes. I started gently, my voice steady. "Mom, I wanted to ask why you weren't at the funeral." Her response was immediate, rehearsed. "It's complicated. Financial matters. And you know, things are never simple." Her words were precise, measured, but I caught the slight hesitation in her tone. I held her gaze, noting the subtle flicker of unease, the micro-expressions that betrayed the rehearsed calm. I asked about the insurance money, carefully phrasing each question to prompt clarity, to expose inconsistencies without giving her the advantage of angered speech. She tried to gaslight me, suggesting I misunderstood, that the situation was more tangled than I realized, but I remained composed, documenting everything in my mind, parsing her intentions, detecting the faint tremor that revealed her worry. The conversation sharpened, my voice calm yet unwavering, the tension thick as she realized I was neither intimidated nor confused. I reached into my bag and laid out the documents, the emails, the statements, the evidence that contradicted every claim she had made. Her eyes widened, a mixture of shock and the defensive edge of someone confronted with undeniable truth. The veiled threats were there, subtle mentions of influence and connections, but they only underscored her vulnerability. I responded with measured calm, explaining why the funds belonged to my daughter, why her legacy could not be redirected at whim. I observed her body language, the clenched jaw, the tightening of her fingers around the armrest, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, and adjusted my approach, emphasizing logic over emotion, strategy over reaction. Every word, every pause, reinforced my authority, my refusal to be manipulated, my readiness to protect what was rightfully mine. The air between us vibrated with confrontation, yet I remained grounded, anchored by a combination of evidence, preparation, and inner resolve. Just then, my sister entered, a casual observer unaware of the intensity of the exchange. Her curiosity was immediate, her face shifting between confusion and mild unease. I addressed her briefly, carefully planting subtle reminders of fairness and consequence, letting her witness the tension without fully intervening. I watched how her reactions influenced my mother, noting the cracks in alliances and the faint opportunities for shifts in loyalty. The presence of my sister added an unpredictable layer, a living variable that could tilt the balance if navigated correctly. I felt the weight of family dynamics, how leverage and perception intertwined, and I used it deliberately, quietly steering the situation toward clarity and eventual justice. Before I could leave, my mother's voice dropped low, laced with the faintest edge of menace. "I have connections that protect my plans." The statement hung in the air, an attempt to intimidate, to claim power, to suggest I could be outmaneuvered. I did not flinch. Instead, I gripped the evidence tighter, feeling the sense of control I had cultivated over weeks of preparation. I knew the confrontation was far from over. It was merely the opening of a larger battle that would test patience, strategy, and resilience. My mind raced, calculating next steps while my pulse remained steady. I took a deep breath, looking her in the eyes, and thought, if she thinks she can scare me, she's in for a surprise. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had my determination. I was ready for whatever came next. The morning light seeped through my office window, pale and deliberate, as I spread out the stack of documents, emails, and recordings on my desk. Every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past weeks now demanded a plan, a calculated series of steps that would turn months of manipulation and deceit into leverage. I reviewed the notes from the confrontations with my mother, recalling the tiny cracks in her armor and the flickers of guilt she couldn't fully suppress. I consulted my own mental checklist: legal rights, potential obstacles, allies, and the most likely responses from my family. Each detail sharpened my resolve. Fear had no place here. My thoughts circled around one central aim: reclaim the $900,000 that was rightfully my daughter's and prevent anyone from twisting her legacy for greed. I drafted a step-by-step plan, visualizing each move, anticipating counter-moves, measuring every word, every question, every possible reaction. By the time I closed the folder, I felt the edge of determination settle into me. Today wasn't just about confrontation, it was about reclaiming control. I scheduled a meeting with my attorney, walking into the law office with a calmness that belied the storm in my mind. We reviewed insurance clauses, deadlines, and procedural loopholes, mapping out possible avenues for reclaiming what had been maneuvered away. Then came the warning, sharp and unexpected. My mother had potentially taken preemptive steps to divert the funds. It was a punch of reality, a higher stake than I had anticipated. I leaned back, steadying my breath. Panic wouldn't serve me, strategy would. We discussed creative alternatives, contingency plans, subtle pressures, and timing that could force transparency without outright confrontation. Each suggestion was weighed, measured against both legal strength and emotional consequence. By the end, I walked out with more than legal guidance. I had a blueprint, a mental map of how to convert my mother's overconfidence into tactical advantage. Later, I sought out my sister alone, choosing a neutral space where conversation could unfold without an audience. I introduced small pieces of evidence, carefully framed, watching her reactions flicker between surprise and hesitation. I asked pointed questions, gently nudging her to consider her conscience, to weigh her loyalty not against me but against what was fair for our daughter. She shifted in her seat, avoiding eye contact, clearly torn between her habitual allegiance to our mother and the emerging clarity of the truth. My voice remained steady, persuasive, but not accusatory. Every pause, every word was deliberate. I wasn't trying to coerce, but to illuminate. By the time our conversation ended, I could see the subtle shift, the smallest fracture in old family loyalties. Even that tiny ripple was critical. It could become a channel for future support, a small but meaningful shift in influence. Back at my home office, I began setting traps, not in a malicious sense, but strategically, creating situations where my mother's true intentions regarding the insurance could reveal themselves. I sent controlled emails, framed discussions carefully, monitored responses for overconfidence or evasion. Each interaction was a test, and each reaction was data. I noted her habitual deflections, the way she tried to project calm while concealing anxiety. The deeper I delved, the more apparent it became. She underestimated me. That miscalculation was my leverage. Every digital trace, every word, every gesture became a piece of the puzzle, each move positioning me to reclaim what was rightfully mine. My moral compass guided me. I wasn't scheming for spite, I was protecting a legacy. The tension rose, tangible, as I sensed her readiness to escalate if cornered. I felt prepared. I had built a careful, measured strategy that no amount of manipulation could undermine. Then, an anonymous message arrived, short but potent, a hidden document connected to the insurance, and a note suggesting an ally I hadn't expected. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from opportunity. This was the opening I had been waiting for, the unseen variable that could turn months of preparation into decisive action. I held the note, imagining the confrontation to come, the precision required, the paths I could take. Every step now carried weight. Every choice mattered. I whispered to myself, gripping the paper tight. This is my chance to finally take control. The game had shifted, the board realigned, and I was ready to move with purpose, intelligence, and the certainty that my daughter's future would not be stolen. I arrived at my mother's mansion in the late afternoon, the sunlight slanting across her manicured lawns as if casting judgment. In the quiet of her private study, I spread out every document, every email, every recording I had meticulously gathered. Each piece told the same story: manipulation, greed, and deceit designed to redirect what was rightfully my daughter's. I double-checked authenticity, mentally rehearsing every possible response my mother could throw at me, every line of denial or diversion. I noted subtle inconsistencies in her earlier statements, the tiny gaps that could be leveraged, and the weaknesses in the preemptive moves she'd made. I could feel my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the electric tension of impending confrontation. Every detail mattered, and as I adjusted the stack of papers on her polished desk, I realized the transition from planning to action had finally arrived. Today, strategy would meet reality, and I was ready. I closed the study door behind me and faced my mother, whose expression was a mixture of annoyance and calculated calm. My sister stood nearby, hesitant, unsure where her loyalty should land. I presented the evidence methodically, calmly stating each point, each irregularity, letting the weight of proof do the talking. My mother's initial reaction was a tight-lipped denial, followed quickly by thinly veiled manipulation, attempting to turn guilt and confusion against me. It didn't work. I watched her closely, noting every twitch, every flicker of impatience, every slight hesitation that betrayed the depth of her greed. My sister shifted uncomfortably, the conflict between familial allegiance and moral clarity playing across her face. I held my composure, keeping my voice steady, letting reason and evidence carry authority over intimidation and deceit. The air between us was taut, every word deliberate, every glance loaded with unspoken challenge. I leaned forward, introducing legal perspectives, highlighting the potential consequences of her actions if they were exposed publicly or through formal legal channels. I outlined the steps I was prepared to take, not as a threat, but as a framework for accountability. My mother's calm facade began to crack under the pressure, her responses defensive, reactive. I saw her calculate, weigh, hesitate, suddenly aware that the power balance had shifted. I included my sister subtly in the discussion, asking questions that invited reflection, encouraging her to recognize the truth and choose integrity over blind loyalty. I could see the shift in dynamics, the control once monopolized by my mother now subtly tipping in my favor. My pulse steadied with the mix of triumph and the lingering anxiety of what might still unfold. By the time our discussion wound down, I had secured concrete steps to reclaim my daughter's $900,000 insurance, confirming all documentation and witnesses to ensure legal validation. I set boundaries, clearly stating the terms of engagement moving forward, protecting myself from further manipulation. Sitting back for a moment, I reflected on what this struggle had taught me about trust, resilience, and family. It had been exhausting, infuriating, and yet clarifying. I had uncovered truths I needed to see, and I had positioned myself to act decisively. The weight of injustice was still palpable, but for the first time in months, I felt a cautious optimism settle in alongside empowerment. I had regained control, and every move had been measured, intentional, and morally sound. Then, a confidential message arrived, brief but unsettling. It hinted at an unexpected twist regarding the family inheritance, something I hadn't anticipated. My heart skipped as I read the lines, realizing that while I had reclaimed a major victory, the broader battle was far from over. I folded the note carefully, a tight knot of anticipation and strategy forming in my chest. I whispered to myself, gripping the paper as if it were a lifeline. I thought I had everything under control. But this changes everything. The confrontation had ended, but the game was far from finished, and I knew the next steps would demand every ounce of intelligence and courage I could summon. The evening light filtered through the tall windows of my mother's mansion as I sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out before me one last time. Every email, every recording, every contract was reviewed with painstaking attention. I traced the threads of manipulation she had tried to weave over the years and confirmed that my daughter's $900,000 insurance could be redirected to her estate without a hitch. I rehearsed my statements quietly, imagining my mother's protests, my sister's hesitation. Each potential objection had a response ready, each accusation met with calm clarity. The past months of betrayal flashed in my mind, a grim reminder of what had led to this moment. I drew a slow breath and reminded myself, this was about justice, not revenge. Confidence settled in my chest, steadying the nervous edge in my hands. Tonight, it would end, one way or another. I met with our family lawyer in a modest office not far from the mansion. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of old leather and paper grounding me. We went through the motions, finalizing every legal action so there could be no loophole, no chance for my mother to manipulate outcomes. By the time we returned to the mansion, I was ready. I faced my mother and sister directly in the living room, papers in hand, voice steady. My mother's eyes narrowed as she realized the extent of the evidence against her. The room held a tense silence before she attempted her first line of defense, a feigned calm and subtle guilt-tripping, but it faltered almost immediately under the weight of documented proof. My sister shifted uneasily beside her, glancing between us, caught in the swirl of betrayal and revelation. I spoke plainly, laying out facts, my tone firm, my gaze unyielding. Every word was deliberate, every point undeniable. I could feel the shift, empowerment settling over me like armor. For a fleeting moment, my mother tried one last manipulation, invoking old memories, shared hardships, attempting to pull sympathy. I let her speak, listening quietly, then countered with measured reasoning, leaving no room for misdirection. My sister's eyes widened, comprehension dawning as she absorbed the truth about her mother's selfishness and deceit. She hesitated, then leaned slightly toward me, a subtle but significant alignment. The desperation in my mother's posture was stark against the calm precision of my own actions. Every detail I had anticipated played out exactly as I had planned, every move reinforcing my legal and moral authority. The tension in the room was almost tangible as my mother's control unraveled, replaced by a quiet, undeniable recognition of her own exposure. Once the confrontation reached its peak, I turned to securing my daughter's future. The $900,000 insurance was now fully within reach, allocated to her estate under proper legal oversight. I ensured witnesses and documentation were aligned, and every step reinforced the ethical path we had taken. Sitting back, I felt the tension drain slowly, leaving relief, cautious satisfaction, and a hard-earned sense of empowerment. I reflected on the lessons embedded in the struggle, the dangers of blind trust, the resilience required to navigate family treachery, and the importance of standing firm without compromising integrity. Allies, both unexpected and steadfast, had made this possible, and for that, I allowed myself a quiet nod of gratitude. As I prepared to leave the mansion for the evening, a brief message appeared on my phone. It hinted at an opportunity outside the confines of family disputes, something small but intriguing, a reminder that life would continue to challenge and surprise. I read it, smiled faintly, and whispered to myself, the fight for my daughter was over, but life still had surprises waiting for me. I folded the message carefully, feeling a renewed sense of independence and resilience settle around me like a warm cloak. Justice had been served, power reclaimed, and though the future remained uncertain, I faced it with confidence. Morning sunlight spilled into the kitchen of my new home, and for the first time in years, I felt the quiet weight of a life untangled from manipulation. The coffee brewed, the scent sharp and grounding as I reviewed my daughter's school schedule and my own calendar for the week. No one to deceive me, no one to undermine my choices. I checked accounts, confirmed bills, and made plans with a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. Friends who had emerged unexpectedly during the chaos now became part of my routine. People I could rely on without second-guessing intentions. Running errands, preparing meals, and balancing work all became exercises in quiet strategy. Small victories that confirmed I was capable, intelligent, and resilient. Even the mundane felt like a reclamation of power. Each decision I made was deliberate, informed, and free from the shadow of past betrayals. There was still caution, of course, but it no longer carried fear, only awareness. Afternoons were often spent with my daughter, moments that had once been strained by secrecy and tension now filled with laughter and honest conversation. She told me, between bites of a shared snack, how much she admired the way I handled everything, how she felt safer knowing I could stand firm. I used those moments to teach lessons about self-respect, about recognizing toxic behavior before it could take root, about the value of boundaries. Her questions were sharp, sometimes probing, always sincere, and I answered with patience, turning life experience into guidance. Watching her grow more confident and secure brought a warmth I hadn't realized I'd missed. Pride welled up quietly, the kind that doesn't need recognition, just the knowledge that she understood what it meant to navigate the world with integrity. Our conversations wandered from dreams to daily challenges, and each laugh or pause cemented the bond that betrayal had once threatened to fracture. Evenings offered a different kind of fulfillment, I joined a small group mentoring younger women in business and financial literacy, sharing insights and practical advice I had learned through hardship. Some of them came timidly, unsure of their own potential. Others carried doubts that mirrored my own past fears. Seeing their confidence grow reminded me that life outside my family's drama had purpose and value. Small challenges arose, miscommunications, unexpected obstacles, moments that tested patience, but handling them calmly, strategically, reaffirmed the growth I had earned. Recognition came subtly, a thank you note, a smile of understanding, a shared achievement. Each acknowledgement was a quiet testament to resilience, proving that leadership didn't require domination, only clarity and empathy. Near the end of one session, an email arrived. Brief, unassuming, hinting at an opportunity abroad. I tucked it away, curiosity sparked, a reminder that life still had doors to open. And as night approached, I reflected on the journey from betrayal to this new normal. Memories of manipulation, deceit, and struggle formed the backdrop against which my current peace shone. I thought about the lessons learned: trust cautiously, act wisely, hold firm to principles, and expressed quiet gratitude for the allies who had remained steadfast. Sitting on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker over the bay, I felt a renewed confidence settle in my chest. Life had taught hard truths, but it had also shown me strength I hadn't fully known. And just when I thought life had settled, a new door quietly creaked open, promising challenges, growth, and possibilities I was ready to meet on my own terms. The morning air felt unusually crisp as I stepped out of my front door, key in hand, feeling the weight of months, no, years, finally lifting. Walking down the quiet streets, I replayed everything that had led me here. The betrayals, the sleepless nights, the quiet moments of doubt, and the small victories that had slowly stitched my confidence back together. Today, I wasn't just stepping into another routine. I was reclaiming what had been taken from me, not with anger, but with clear, deliberate intention. I had arranged to meet my sister at a local cafe, not to argue, not to relive the old wounds, but to speak plainly, firmly, with no trace of weakness. When she arrived, I held her gaze steadily. "I've learned a lot since we last spoke," I began, keeping my voice calm but unmistakably assertive. "I don't need your approval, and I won't allow manipulation to define my life again. But I'm willing to close this chapter with clarity, yours and mine." Silence followed for a moment, her eyes flickering between shame and something like grudging acknowledgement. I didn't push. I simply outlined boundaries, legal and personal, with the precision of someone who had learned to think 2 steps ahead. No shouting, no recrimination, just measured, undeniable authority. As I left the cafe, a sense of relief settled over me, tempered by satisfaction, knowing the past could no longer dictate my choices. Back home, the day shifted into practical matters. The paperwork I had been delaying, the financial settlements, the property titles, the careful documentation of accounts, was now approached with strategic focus. Each signature, each verified statement felt like a reclaiming of agency. A minor complication arose when one of the accounts showed an unexpected hold, a reminder that vigilance was still necessary. I took a deep breath, made a few calls, and resolved it calmly. Every move was deliberate, calculated, and independent. The satisfaction of seeing systems respond to clarity rather than manipulation was intoxicating. By afternoon, everything was settled, and I allowed myself a moment to lean back and exhale. Achievement was tangible, and yet I knew it was also a foundation for future endeavors. An email notification caught my attention. Another small challenge, a professional opportunity that required careful consideration. I smiled quietly, realizing life could still surprise me, even when the past felt resolved. Evening brought reflection and celebration, a quieter acknowledgement of the journey. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer across the bay. Memories of struggle flitted through my mind, but they no longer carried pain, only lessons and proof of resilience. I thought of the friends and allies who had supported me, the moments of unexpected kindness, and the small but meaningful victories that had cemented my sense of self-worth. I whispered to myself a quote I had long admired. "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Each word resonated with my experience, each memory affirming the person I had become. Independent, intelligent, and unshakably firm in my values. Pride swelled quietly, not boastful, just present, a deep recognition that I could now navigate life on my terms. Night fell, but my mind already reached forward. I considered the ambitions I had shelved for years, projects, travel, new business ventures, and felt a renewed determination. There was hope, yes, but also a measured readiness for challenges that might test every skill and lesson I had accumulated. I knew the past was behind me, yet the horizon suggested that life would continue to present puzzles, opportunities, and decisions that demanded strength. Just when I thought the past was behind me, a new horizon appeared, calling for every ounce of strength I had built. I felt ready, anchored by experience, and invigorated by the knowledge that the life I claimed was truly my own. The circle was complete, not in closure alone, but in the confident, forward-looking steps I would continue to take.